And welcome back. A senior UN official has called on Myanmar authorities to investigate the reported killings of at least 35 civilians that opposition activists have blamed on government soldiers. The ruling military has not commented on the killings in Kayah State over the weekend. Media there has reported that soldiers had fired and killed an unspecified number of terrorists with weapons, as they put it, in the village. It did not say anything about civilians. That's according to reports from state media. UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths has said that there were credible reports that civilians, including at least one child, were forced from vehicles, killed and burned. Myanmar has been in turmoil since the military on February the 1st overthrew the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. To speak a little bit more about this, we're joined now by Dr. Maung Zarni, a Burmese educator, academic and human rights activist. So very good evening to you, Dr. Zadie. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. The reports that you've heard, what do they say happened particularly?
Well, this cannot be understood as an isolated incident of mass atrocities, where the 33 Burmese of different ethnic backgrounds, including children and the Save the Children staff, were basically summarily executed. And then some of them the bodies were burned, as a attempt to erase the evidence. So obviously, the Burmese, regime troops knew that this was a criminal act, and therefore they needed to, eliminate the evidence of what would be a crime against humanity. But I think earlier you mentioned about the UN official Martin Griffiths, orchard head, and also other diplomats around the world asked the regime to launch a thorough investigation. I mean, it is, the Burmese were outraged by the fact that the United Nations officials and other government diplomats were asking the Burmese military, the perpetrating regime, to investigate its own crime. It's like asking, the Nazi Party or the SS to investigate what was happening in different forced labor and death camps around, Nazi-occupied Europe. And, this is a systemic problem, because you're a South African, channel. Let me just bring the analogy here. We have a regime that has committed genocide, institutionalized destruction of a particular ethnic minority called Rohingya, that was going on for almost about 40 years. And the United Nations knew about this over the last since 1994, when the UN General Assembly appointed or mandated the appointment of special rapporteur investigator to look into the human rights situation in Myanmar. That's from 1994. The UN keeps repeating this mantra. The authorities must hold the perpetrators to account, or open investigation, or allow outside investigators to come in, or establish accountability. And now we are in the middle of basically a society-wide revolution. I don't use the word lightly. You went through apartheid for 70 years or longer, and we have been living under this, the genocidal military regime for the last almost 60 years. They've been in power since 1962 March. And so finally, the Burmese people have had enough of the regime, and also that we have given up any hope that the United Nations all the good members of the UN system would do anything to end the the genocidal and criminal conditions under which we have been forced to live. This is like an anti-apartheid struggle. Mandela going underground, organizing armed resistance. That is precisely what is happening. It is not simply about another military regime. We are looking at a systemic repression of the entire society of multi-ethnic nations.
Allow me to ask this question.
Yes, please.
As you said, and the world has been alerted of this, the systemic killing, oppression of the Rohingya. Reports are that, the violence there against citizens is escalating. This year alone, reports say about 1,300 people have been killed since the civilian unrest or resistance. Is it now widespread, or is it still targeting the minorities? In this case, what happened here, we understand that the military just called people from their cars and attacked them and then, as you say, burnt them. Was it a random incident, or is this what is going on throughout the country?
Well, there are two things that are going on. There has been an institutionalized destruction of Rohingya since the late 1970s, that amounted to genocide. Most genocide scholars, universally agree that this is genocide. The interpretations of state crimes, along the lines of a genocide, it's not a precise science, not rocket science, but, that we have a near universal agreement among international scholars and lawyers around the world that the Burmese military has committed and commissioned the crime of genocide in violation of the Genocide Convention we as a member state, as a Myanmar, has signed and ratified as early as 1950s. And then the second one that has been happening is the Burmese military, and then to a degree, like the civilian politicians such as Aung San Suu Kyi, now ousted NLD leader, were basically pursuing internal colonial policies and practices where the majority Burmese Buddhists, from which I come from, have instituted internal colonialism towards 40% of the total population, they're made up of Christians and other ethnic groups and other religious minorities in Burma. And that internal colonial political system has been in place, several months after independence from Britain in 1948. And so that had triggered over 70 years of essentially resistance, armed resistance movements from virtually every ethnic minority. And what has happened since February coup this year, with the ouster of Aung San Suu Kyi and the overthrow of the democratically elected government of National League for Democracy, the equivalent of ANC in the Burmese context, is that the dominant society itself has decided they have had enough of miserable life under a fascist-like occupational military. So this is extraordinary because, if you look at the former Yugoslavia and what happened, 6 republics breaking apart, after the death of the Marshal Tito over there in the 1990s, in the process known as Balkanization. We are in a worse situation than the Balkans, because in the Balkans, at least, as murderous as it was, the Serbian army enjoyed the popular support from ethnic Serbs, right, in the 1990s. And now we have a national army that no longer enjoys the popular support, legitimacy, or endorsement from either within the mainstream Burmese society or, needless to say, the minority. So the Burmese people see the situation more akin to the Nazi-occupied Europe or fascist Japan-occupied Burma and Southeast Asia of 1940s than fighting a military coup. You asked, whether the persecution is widespread or limited to only a few areas. I would say the people continue to live in fear. But what is unprecedented is that the Burmese have decided if they want to live a free and democratic life, they have to fight this regime by any means possible. It's very much like the ANC in its armed struggle phase. People are making homemade weapons like, the improvised explosive devices, IED and arms and whatnot. And then, those who are not involved in the armed resistance across the country against this regime, people would shut down malls and, states and state organizations and NGOs in designated days. We call them silent strikes. Entire country, towns and cities would be turned into ghostly places. And so there are multiple acts of resistance that is going on, and it's not enough for UN or any other country to say, well, stay peaceful or violence is not going to achieve your accomplishment. Well, you don't say that to the American colonies when the Americans rose up against the tyrannical regime of King George from UK. You don't tell that to the ANC, revolutionaries. Stay peaceful when you are confronted with the unrelenting murderous system of apartheid. So don't tell us to stay peaceful. Okay. We have exhausted any means of peaceful
Dr.
resistance.
Zarni, allow me to ask this final question. And if you can, as briefly as possible, just how much is the People's Defence Force growing? We've seen visuals of people leaving their homes to go to the jungle to arm up for the resistance. And is it enough to bring down the Tatmadaw if, for instance, as you say, multilateralism is failing?
Well, I think what the revolutionary movement is facing, the fundamental obstacle at this point is not receiving concrete material support from neighboring countries in the form of humanitarian assistance, in the form of arms, in the form of intelligence, technology, right? So people are making do. That's not enough. And that we have $1 billion that belongs to the Burmese public that has been frozen by the Joe Biden administration since February coup. That money needs to be unfrozen so that the revolution could rely on our own resources. We are not begging the world to come and rescue us or to even give us money. We are simply telling the Americans and others, we have our sovereign people's money, $1 billion to be exact, frozen in the U.S. system. Joe Biden, with executive order, can unfreeze that and hand it over to the popularly elected representatives operating under the umbrella of national unity government. Yeah, and then secondly, I think we are asking the corporations and governments that have direct the multi-billion-dollar business dealings with the Burmese military. We're not talking about China, telling China not to come or Singapore not to invest. We're telling the Americans and the French and the European Union corporations, like oil and gas, pumping billions of dollars into the coffer of this fascist-like regime. We're telling them, freeze the money, stop the financial flow to this regime, and don't terror finance this regime. If those two things can be accomplished, I think we have a very good chance of changing the system, the way South Africans were able to, dismember apartheid.
Thank you so much for your time and the education, indeed. That there is Dr. Maung Zarni. He's a Burmese educator, academic, and human rights activist, as you heard him explain the situation in Myanmar, just explaining to us what he feels is